Welcome to the Big Rethink, brought to you by NewCities. I'm your host, Greg Lindsay. Today, September 23rd, 2020. U.S. deaths from COVID-19 have crossed 200,000 and global deaths are approaching 1 million. My guest this week is Madeline Ashby, who is co-author of the new book, How to Future, and a prolific science fiction novelist. She'll be joining me in just a little bit for a very special futures-themed episode here of the Big Rethink to talk about foresight and talk about the skill of how do we think about the future and also how do we create multiple futures. We are, of course, at a time of climate change, of a global pandemic, of many of the dystopian events that foresight experts have been warning us for years about. And so now what do we do about it? But before I invite Madeline out, I want to, of course, present a couple of slides here for you. So where are we? There we are. How to Future. This is Madeline's book. Co-authored with Scott Smith of Changes, where she's also a partner. Some of my favorite foresight experts here. We're going to talk about it with her in just a little bit. Really about sort of, what are the appropriate tools and ways of thinking about futures. But as a way of sort of introducing this idea here, of course, this goes back to the notion of the future. We talk all the time at NewCities and elsewhere about the future of cities as if there is a singular future. This, of course, is one of the first pitfalls of the practice. This is an op-ed co-authored by Scott Smith, Madeline's co-author here, really talking about this notions of what he calls flat pack futures, corporate futures that are handed to you. All you have to do is assemble them. What we're going to talk about with Madeline is really about, how do you actually create the space to imagine multiple futures and really sort of, build the capacity for yourself internally to actually cope with environments of high volatility, uncertainty, and change. So as an example of some of the, radical alternatives to sort of the present, but extended, I want to mention a few slides here from Chase Springett's talk last year on solar punk. And for those of you who are unfamiliar, solar punk, like in a way, which the name comes from cyberpunk from the 1980s, but solar punk is a radically sort of utopian optimistic exercise in thinking through the futures of abundance made possible by infinite renewable energy. And of course, not just, taking our current world and powering it all on electrons, but thinking about, what futures become possible from there. And of course, again, I mentioned it's radically utopian. This is a great, this is from the original sort of solar punk manifesto from 2014. This notion of positioning it as a way of thinking about the future that doesn't fall back into dystopian tropes. There's Madeline's face blocked out, but this going back to, again, what she'll talk about here, this notion of that we need to be incredibly vociferous in thinking about the future and putting it out there. And, one of the other great foresight experts I love to follow is Paul Graham-Raven, who's currently working on a project right now on, I think it's the sort of, one of the various travel guides to a carbon-free Europe set in the 2040s. So one of the things that foresight experts do so well and work with you on is creating design fictions and various artifacts. How do we create concrete versions of the future that help us visualize what they'll look like and help us actually sort of create change in our organizations and our electorates and so forth. So just a quick example, and then I'll bring Madeline out here. If you've been following the news, of course, and following various episodes of the Big Rethink, that we've talked a lot about the fact that, that climate migration is now becoming a real thing. We're hosting our Higher Ground event in December that's going to really grapple with notions of climate migration and managed retreat. These are some maps produced by ProPublica in the last few weeks here related to the New York Times Magazine story, showing how the ideal habitable zone of the United States is shifting north due to various climate maps here, including into Canada. For those of you who are joining, Madeline is from Toronto, will be joining us momentarily from there. But thinking through like what these futures will look like. And as you can see, the Great Lakes, form, the Rust Belt for the present. It's been hypothesized, that this could be good for the Great Lakes in the future. We could see a migration, hopefully in a positive way, of people towards these Rust Belt towns and revitalize them. And this is an exercise, Ports sort of indulged in a sort of design fiction exercise in imagining what one of these towns might look like in the 2050s. And so here they show a map, for example, of how the fact the Midwest has been sort of overlooked so far despite this. And they invented a fictional town called Leaside, where, and mapped out a whole fictional history of it, about imagining how climate migrants came there and revitalized this Rust Belt town somewhere on the Great Lakes. I've indulged in a similar exercise myself a few years ago with the architects Rafi Siegel and Susanna Drake, thinking through, what the coasts of New York and New Jersey might look like in 2067. So, therefore we imagined amphibious architecture. We, created Jamaica Bay outside JFK is now the vast green park. And as part of my role in the team, I, in this case, How to Do Futures the Wrong Way, I basically sort of backfilled from the images and, imagined governors Andrew Cuomo and John Bon Jovi selling off the Port Authority after Hurricane Hermine in 2022 to sell it to the Singaporeans, who then actually developed this kind of housing and built up JFK. And I think the scenario ended with a financial crisis in 2023 due to the various shocks of climate change and Mark Zuckerberg becoming president in 2024. I promise I wasn't trying to start out dystopian, but that's where we ended up. But this is all part of these various tools, and I think Madeline will talk about it in just a second here, about how do we think through futures and how do we create these assemblages, as John Wilshire, another collaborator frequently with the Changes Group, likes to describe them. So typically, if you know futures, there's the futures cone, which goes back 40, 50, 60 years at this point, about imagining, probable, plausible, possible futures. Here, sort of, John's expanded this to think about, how do we think even further back in time in the past about what was once possible, or what's tangible, what's remembered and forgotten, and how do we project that forward in time? So it's quite the four-dimensional exercise, so to speak. All right, so on that note, let's drop off the slides here. Let's bring you back. Madeline, if you want to come on out of hiding now, please. Thank you for joining. Thank you for joining for our live studio audience. I should note once again here, we're gonna have questions in the second half from the gentlemen who are here and who else joins. But yeah, as a first question, Madeline, I mean, obviously, how to future. Could you talk a bit about the book and talk a bit about, as always, where foresight experts differ from, faith popcorn and futurists as we know them?
Yeah, well, first I should clarify, I'm not technically a partner at Changes. I'm sort of I don't know, agent provocateur. I'm a collaborator there. I guess I do have the T-shirt though. I do get a care package every year. So like, that's really the important thing. I get sent chocolate every year, which is really like the most important part of the contribution. So How to Future came about as I was invited to write. I got sort of pitched to write a book on foresight by a different publisher, and I knew that one, even though I've been sort of a freelance foresighter and futurist for 10 years, I didn't really have a whole book in me quite yet. And because that's what happens when you write a master's thesis, like that's the book already. And I also knew that I would be in breach of contract with my other publishers, my actual science fiction publishers, if I wrote a book with somebody else. So I said, hey, I don't have a book in me, but you know who does? Are my collaborators, Scott Smith and Susan Cox Smith over at Changes, and I would be very happy to work with them, as I always am. And so we developed a proposal, and ultimately that proposal went to our publisher, Kogan Page Inspire, and they ran with it, and we said we want to do something that hasn't been done before. There's a real gap in the existing foresight literature. There's a lot of canonical foresight literature. There's a ton. You can find it. You can find it on Amazon. You can find it in libraries. You can go into journals. You can read full text articles. There's all kinds of stuff. But there is less for the introductory for introductory practice. There's less for people who are just starting out, who might not want to be professional futurists, but who want to cultivate a foresighting capacity within themselves, within their organization, within their neighborhood, within their community group. There aren't necessarily a whole lot of texts written for the basement of your community center, and your C-suite. And we wanted a book that would go to both places equally well. And we've also been in the position, certainly this is true of me, I've taught foresight at the graduate level, and I've still, like when people who are getting terminally degreed in foresight, I've still had questions from students saying, okay, all of this theory is good, but how do you do it? And this book strives to answer that question for as many people as we can. And it may, in fact, like answer that question so much that you may decide, oh, wait, this is not where I thought I was going to go, or what have you, in which case we've saved you a lot of trouble.
Well, I mean, one group you mentioned, the C-suite, you mentioned community groups. For a second, can you talk a bit about cities and public officials as well as helping them do this? Obviously, at NewCities, we deal with them all the time, and of course, starved of time and resources in dealing with electorates. How can you use the book and use foresight in general to help public officials who are responding in very narrow timeframes to very needy electorates, to help them think more deeply on this? And I'm curious your work. I know you guys have taught at the Dubai Future Foundation.
Yep.
So there's some monarchies perhaps have a longer time horizon.
Yeah, I've done work on cities. I've written science fiction prototypes about smart cities for people like Data and Society and others. I have, sort of been called to. I've done strong mayors workshops at South by Southwest, stuff like that. What I really like about municipalities is that they bring forward people with a lot of different skill sets and a more diverse skill set than you often see in a single executive boardroom or what have you. My husband has covered Toronto City Hall for the past 30 years and has a huge amount of expertise in the tiny incremental way that progress gets made in a city, or even not progress but just change. Even something as simple as putting in a traffic light or a stop sign can turn into this massive, can get people quite irate, and can get people quite impassioned. And I think that that's what people forget when they're talking about change in cities, is that it's also an identity piece. It's also about how you feel about where you live. And so in our work, we have to be responsible for looking not just at like the global trends and the local trends that have an impact on that space on a city, but also at the social trends that have been consistent in a city over time, and how demographics are changing, and sort of look at, okay, well, yeah, but where is this actually going? And that, I think, is, I like looking at city-based systems for that reason, because they are so dynamic, and because people do get impassioned about them. It's not, what kind of headphones are people going to be using in 5 years? It's, how do people want to live? And that's a social question. That's an emotional question that I always, especially as a fiction writer, I like to dig into.
No. Yeah, I would say I've enjoyed some of your short stories in particular on thinking through distributed. Well, you did a great one on imagining a blockchain DAO, but for Uber. I believe it was a woman who was trying to get intel on her spouse's infidelity, and so she laid a trap for an autonomous vehicle.
Did I do that?
I knew you're
sure.
prolific.
Did I? Oh yeah. It wasn't an infidelity. It was that that would have been a good story. But but it was about there's a story that I wrote for Slate called Domestic Violence, which was about the use of smart home systems against partners in a domestic abuse situation. And her friend gets revenge by sending her husband's car into a pithead mine up in northern Canada by exploiting the system.
I remembered it ended darkly. Well, that gets to the point. But that gets to the point further, and I'm curious. One of the big questions about foresight, you mentioned how do you do it? But to me, the open question is how do you create systemic change from it? It's always like the workshop problem, right? You can lead workshop participants to the workshop, but how do you inculcate that culture, and how do you drive the systemic change? And I just want to bring up, since you mentioned technology there. A few weeks ago we had Bianca Wiley, our last Toronto participant, and Bianca and I talked about the fact that public officials seem helpless before technology executives. They believe that technology execs know the future, and that public officials have this sort of learned helplessness. How do they unlearn that helplessness? And how can we use foresight to build this capacity? And how do you measure it?
Well, I think that there's a difference between knowing what is possible and knowing what people want. And I think that where municipal officials are at their strongest is in having a close connection to their communities and knowing what those communities actually want, and being willing to sort of sit in those sessions and listen to people rail at them or figure out what it is that they want. Because you can sell people on a technology that is a perfect technology, but if you can't get them to want it, it will not get the uptake. This is the classic Betamax question, right? It was ideal, it was perfect. Why didn't people want it? Why did they go for an inferior format? We have this play out across technologies all the time. And it's the same for a lot of governance. It's the same for a lot of policies. It's why did you want this thing that ultimately wasn't going to serve you, ultimately wasn't going to help you? The thing about sort of policymakers, when they are doing their best work, I think they are able to join up what people are actually asking for with what is available, and also to help their constituents or their citizens or their participants or what have you connect with a sense of agency in their governance or in their municipal life, right? I mean, again, to go back to that traffic light or that stop sign, once you've done that with a community, they suddenly realize that a lot of change is actually possible. But you have to get over that hurdle of making it possible for them. And often it's in these tiny things. You know, there's been a lot of talk recently about whether or not the age of incrementalism is over. And I think what we forget when we talk about that is that for some people, they've been so conditioned to believe that change is impossible that you need to prove it to them in a test case, almost. You know, in design thinking, we talk about prototyping. In science fiction prototyping, we also use that language, that you have to give people an example or a practice run before they go out swinging for the fences, because that gives them the confidence to move forward. And I think like the problem that we sometimes run into in actioning change from a vision, like going from like vision to mission to strategy to tactics to actions, is in thinking out the very tiny the very tiny actions that a person or that a group can take to move those things forward, forgetting that for as small as those things are, they can have big ripples. They can really change a lot, and they can really change a lot for the people you're closest to.
Yeah, interesting. There's a lot of questions there. One thing I want to ask maybe slightly here is, well, I mean, in that imagining change too, I mean, you know, you're one of the first futurist books to talk a bit about like how does one not doom scroll? You know, I don't think you use the word in the book, but
Yes.
like it's been really interesting to me, and I've talked about this with Scott and Susan actually, because yeah, I mean, I feel slightly better now, now that I don't know, passed some sort of barrier. Also, crossing the border to Montreal helped. But yeah, I spent several years in the early Trump administration doom scrolling a lot and didn't have a name for it. And now we're all doom scrollers. And like,
yes.
and so my question is, you know, it's very easy to imagine dystopian futures. It's very easy to fall under the thrall of dystopian futures. As a professional science fiction author and foresight person, I'm curious what advice you and Scott have and what you would share with people. Like, how do we not doom scroll? How do we remain optimistic? That's partly why I want to talk about solar punk. That's like still one of the few visions that like really is radical, that is really radically utopian as well. Like it's like post-capitalist, post-abundance, and it's a sort of heroic embracing of the future versus like a shrinking of it or an internal emigre or other strategies.
Right. I think that where Scott and I align on that question is that we both believe in having really firm boundaries between you and the thing that you are consuming, and being able to establish sort of critical distance between you and the media that you're consuming, whether it's fictional or not, whether it's on your Twitter feed or whether it's on your television or whether it's in a book that you're reading or a film that you're watching or something like that. We both believe in like actually drawing some pretty firm boundaries and being able to step away and take a critical distance and saying like, well, okay, you know, the classic questions, where did it come from? Who benefits? Things like that. Because ultimately doom scrolling benefits no one but the person who owns the platform. And this is a conclusion that we talk about in the book, is that, you know, your body has a physiological reaction to doom scrolling. It releases dopamine for intermittent reward, the same reaction that happens when you pull a lever in Vegas at a slot machine. That same reaction happens in the brain when you hit refresh on Twitter. It's, you know, it's an addictive system. And ultimately the only people who profit from that are the people who create that reaction. And so we talk a lot about like not giving energy to trolls or what have you. And it's kind of similar in that, you know, how much of you are you losing to this process? And therefore, how much of your objectivity is being taken from you? How much of your criticality is being taken from you? How much of your ability to stand back from a problem and evaluate it, you know, honestly, is being taken away from you? Because when you are distracted, when you are despairing, when you feel empty, when you feel drained, that's when you can be taken advantage of. Whether that's in an interpersonal interaction or whether that's you not knowing how to react to a piece of news, you know, whether it's you being more susceptible to commercials or something like that, you know, that's where you lose agency. And one of the things that we both landed on for this book was that we really wanted people to come away, having read it, feeling more powerful, feeling empowered, feeling as though they had more agency in their lives than they knew that they had. you've always had that control, you've always had that agency, but no one wants to tell you that. And so we wanted people to walk away feeling stronger, feeling more powerful than they did before. And I think in terms of, I get asked the utopia dystopia question a lot, and I think what's funny about it is that I wrote a novel called Company Town for Tor Books, which takes place on in the future on an oil rig off the coast of Newfoundland that is converting. It's an oil rig that's converting to fusion energy. It's an oil rig where there's unionized sex workers, where there's vertical farming, where there's healthcare for everybody without question. There's body modifications that alter things like seizures and depression and anxiety disorders and things like that, like via vagus nerve stimulation and what have you. And people still called it a dystopia. And why? Because it's about a corporation taking over a town. So our relationship to what is dystopian also alters over time, and is dynamic. And so I think the task now, I try not to think about designing a quote unquote more utopian future, because those always get weaponized against people. Your utopia is always dependent on somebody else's, dystopia. It requires a layer of dystopia to work. Usually it's at the level of workers or somebody else who's being exploited in some way in order to make that possible, which Ursula Le Guin talks about it metaphorically in The Ones Who Walk Away from Omelas, right? That, for all of this utopia, there's usually one person who's being sacrificed, or like the lottery or something like that. In order to preserve this community, we have to have this. What was Shirley Jackson, talking about things like the draft. So I think that, rather than using that language, it's ultimately beneficial. For my part, what I think about doing is what is the story that will actually engage people? When people tell stories about, waves of migrants who will take your jobs, or drugs are everywhere and they're gonna hurt your children. That's a story. That's a narrative, and you have to find a better one. If you want to alter that narrative, you have to counter it. Any crisis manager, any brand consultant, any comms person, any stratcom person will tell you that. Anyone, speaking of municipalities, every stratcom person who has worked for a city knows that to be true and says, well, that's your story, but this is mine.
Well,
and
well, that's a good segue here in terms of stories. I want to interrupt you there when it comes to that.
No,
we have a few minutes, and we have our live studio audience. But Patrick has a great question here. Patrick Tenkey of Sentier is joining us. Going back to Madeline's statement about talking often and loudly about the futures we want, and then using the book for your community center. How can foresight be used by citizen groups to talk loudly to City Hall? And the one thing I want to add to that as addendum is, when it comes back to strategic comms, Sidewalk Toronto, of course, which was defeated ultimately by citizen pressure, built an elaborate foresight center and published huge volumes of flat pack futures and commissioned Thomas Heatherwick to do renderings. This incredible narrative, which still didn't gain enough traction, fortunately. So how do we do the opposite? When you're faced with someone like a Sidewalk Toronto that has a huge, marketing operation, how can community groups push back using foresight to their elected officials to show them this vision? Like what's tactical urbanism for foresight look like, perhaps? Instead of painting a bike lane, how do I host a workshop?
I want that to be the next book. I feel like there's a book in that question in and of itself, which I really am thrilled by. It's so good because I think you end up sort of reversing what Sidewalk did. I mean, because you can't say that Sidewalk was unsuccessful. They were successful up until a point. They were very successful up until a point, until there was significant resistance. But they were initially successful in having a beautiful book that they showed people, in sort of creating a vision of a future that was very attractive to the municipal officials and policymakers that they needed to convince. Where citizen groups succeeded was in being, I think, hyper-local and highly specific. And in, again, making it about identity. They were able to say, look, Google, you're an American company and this isn't America. This is Toronto and we do things differently here. and we have different asks. We aren't just prototype America. We aren't just America 2.0. We aren't just America that 9/11 didn't happen to. You know, and I think that that was where the counter was to say, we aren't what you think we are. We are different. We have different needs. We have different desires. We have different fears. We have different anxieties. We are coming from a different place. And I think where policymakers at the municipal level and where activists at the municipal level really succeed is when they bring data from other cities or research from other places to bear on the specificity of their situation, and to say, look, this is about the people closest to us. I'm not trying to make change for like somebody 300 miles away. I'm trying to make change for my next door neighbor. You know, I'm trying to do something for the social fabric here, because ultimately, like what we're seeing in terms of the climate crisis and in terms of, you know, whether it's storms, wildfires, quakes, like whatever it is, or disease, people are ultimately more dependent on their locality, you know, on their neighbors, on their local hospital, on their local Red Cross, on their, you know, those groups are the people who are there for you in that moment of crisis. And so I think that being able to tailor your solutions and tailor your approaches or your narratives to something that is so highly specific and that really shows an appreciation for the identity of a place or the sense of place is where you can convince people.
Interesting. I want to ask, you know, it strikes me, or at least this is my personal view on it, that there's a utopian streak that runs through foresight practitioners, right? Like the present is the present. It's probably getting worse to varying degrees. But there's notion that, you know, to truly, you know, that basically that you want to envision a completely different world, and perhaps there are, you know, nihilistic ones. Dominic Cummings trying to run his own sort of, you know, foresight shop with Gibsonian weirdos, the ones he's looking for, et cetera. But yeah, I guess I'm sort of curious about, like, you know, what are some of the more, you know, how do you truly break free of constraints in working with people to help them realize this? I've been to a number of settings, for example, you know, with government workshops and whatever else. Santa Fe Institute, I went to one on rethinking capitalism. And I just thought it was really interesting that, you know, to have these people tell us, like, we're going to rethink everything, but then to literally be told, accept capitalism, only a fool would believe otherwise. You know, I thought, I was like, you know, where's Frederick Jameson when you need him? Obviously, I could just wheel him out to give his quote there. But yeah, I'm sort of curious about, you know, where you think, you know, and another way of framing this question is, you know, design fiction and science fiction prototyping. Like I always refer to like Futurama at the 1939 World's Fair as like the greatest design fiction exercise.
Yeah.
Sold American suburbia. And, you know, it was reinvented as a critical practice to basically try to, you know, cause people to question their everyday surroundings. Tim Mon recently wrote an essay, I think it was for Vice, showing that like it sort of got corrupted. It's now another corporate practice. My question is, where do you find space for like truly utopian foresight? And is that even possible, or has, you know, capitalism captured foresight again? And, you know, even what you try to do that's utopian gets regurgitated as, you know, products. You know, this is a common critique by Gibson and others.
Again, I try to avoid the utopian language because, like, my utopia is going to be very different from, quite possibly from the people who are asking for the story, or quite possibly from the people who, certainly different from the people who are reading it, because there exists utopia. Other people have utopias in their mind wherein I have no rights. And I have to be aware of that. And I think that there are also utopias that I can imagine that other people would not want to participate in at all. They're utopian for me. They're what I think the best solution is, but that's not necessarily going to be taken up by the widest variety of people. Where I think there's room to grow, or where you harmonize with that, is in recognizing that there is this optimistic strain within a lot of foresight, and it's because the people who sort of founded the discipline were often they had watched a lot of they'd watched a lot of like horrific events happen in the form of world wars and so on, but had not necessarily been impacted in a systemic way. They were not necessarily the victims of systemic racism. They were not the victims of, or they were not oppressed by systemic poverty. They didn't have a sense of how systems could work against a person. And now when we think about systems thinking, there's a social aspect to that as well. When you're doing science fiction prototyping, or when I'm writing a story, or when I'm imagining sort of the future of a given person or group or a technology, I have to remember as an artist, frankly, that, pain exists. There's a lot of futures in there that are trying to be, and I think this is where Scott and I kind of agree about flat pack futures, is that they're all designed as though pain doesn't happen. They're all designed to be pain-free and to be as free of friction as possible. And that's directly inimical, like that's directly orthogonal to the idea of drama as a premise. Drama comes from conflict, which comes from tension, which comes from friction, which comes from problems. You have to talk about problems and have to anticipate. Good futuring sort of anticipates that even when there's a solution, it will cause other problems that you then are responsible for. And you are trying to minimize that fallout for the largest number of people, or for the people that you're working on behalf of. But you have to recognize that, pain is still pain. Humans are still humans. And pain continues to exist, and vulnerability continues to exist. So you have to find, where people are vulnerable, where people still feel that sense of vulnerability. I've written stories about autonomous vehicles that are useful not because they're autonomous vehicles that you don't have to drive, but because you're using them on the way to the funeral of your parents, so that you don't have to worry about driving while you're crying your eyes out. It's very simple human things that we have to think about when we're designing these technologies, or when we're discussing them. And the way through that is not to avoid vulnerability or pain, or what we might consider negative. You have to lean into it. If anything, you have to sort of put your thumb in the bruise and twist. And that's where that's where you find the truth of how people behave.
Well, we have time for two last questions. I'm going to hand them both to David Guilford, who David, I believe, is at HRNA now and was previously somewhere in the sidewalk empire, if I recall correctly. So always fun. But thank you, David, for your questions. So two fast ones. The first one, is there value in imagining positive black swans, or does that breed complacency, i.e. highly unlikely but hugely impactful utopia-esque events? And another way of framing that too, I worked on a project recently for thinking through supply chain risks. And I like how people at the end would be like, and then there's, the magnetic poles reversing, or a meteor strike, or always referring to these massive exogenous events that truly would upend everything, but you can't even worry about it. So yeah, is it worth thinking about, and then a miracle occurs, kind of black swan event?
Well, I mean, certainly you can. I mean, I think that we're living through that scenario now. It's not a miracle, but it's a wild card. And what we know from previous planning exercises, from the presidential transition exercises, we know that there was scenario-based and other planning efforts around a pandemic. We know that, it got simulated, and there was eminent sense in doing that. So I think that looking for those wild cards is appropriate. And also, I think, rather than saying I'm looking for this miraculous wild card, what I would say is, who gets the silver lining in which wild card? Who gets to benefit from a lot of these things? Like, there were people immediately when people started staying home and the roads cleared out and so on, there was an immediate benefit to the natural world. Right, that like carbon emissions sort of slackened a little bit. Suddenly we were able to record more bird song. There were all kinds of, the quote unquote nature is healing meme and what have you. But the flip side is that, there's less retail spending. There's a massive quote unquote like she session. Women are being asked to do not just a second shift, but a third and fourth and fifth shift. Women's sort of participation in the workforce is going back 20 or 30 years. There's fallout, and that's just the sort of distanced impact of losing over 200,000 Americans and millions of, up to 1 million people worldwide, or whatever the latest projection is. I think that looking at, again, those classic questions of who benefits and where does this come from, are helpful when thinking about a miracle or a disaster. It's a miracle for who? who is it a miracle for? You know, is it a miracle for the company, or is it a miracle for a broad range of people? Is it, you know, because, you know, the miracle might be something like a basic income, or a change to healthcare, or easy birth control. You know, if the miracle could be birth control for men, or something like that, right? You know, it's, what do you want to participate in the miracle is another question.
I'm tempted to end it there. That's such a great one-liner, but I've got one last question from David. What's the role of social media in imagining, testing, and or bringing about possible futures? To which I would add, actually, given the question, is like, can doomscrolling be repurposed at this point? And is there a positive use for it? Where I see this rising consensus that like Facebook should basically be thrown into Mount Doom at this point, that there's nothing redeemable about that platform, and some of the others, Twitter and others are, equally, there are negative externalities mount by the day. But yeah, I guess as a question, what luck have you had in doing that? I find Twitter invaluable for sort of like weak signaling. Like I just basically scrape stuff off Twitter all day long. But yeah, can we use?
Yeah, as a futurist, Twitter is really invaluable for weak signaling. It's really great for seeing what's happening at the margins. It's really great for finding different communities that I, in a relatively privileged position, wouldn't have access to, or wouldn't think about. You know, it's great for, I think what we found with Twitter, certainly in its earlier phases, was that it was really great at exposing communities to a mainstream that wouldn't necessarily have gotten access to that mainstream. And that can cut both ways. You know, it can suddenly awaken people to something like the Arab Spring. It can awaken people to the struggles of, it can awaken a mainstream crowd to the struggles that are not experienced by that mainstream crowd. But it can also allow in, fringe cult behavior. It can also lend credence and platform and voice, and in some cases money, to people who will misuse those things and exploit their own audience for their own ends. So I think that, it always does cut both ways. The hammer can build your house or tear apart your skull. That's always going to be true. In terms of using social media, I think that it where it's been used has been, what has been proven useful for it is in providing metrics for sentiment or for change or something like that. For people who are very numbers dependent, it translates culture into a number. I don't necessarily think, I think that that's useful up until a point. I think that that's part of an argument. It isn't the whole of an argument because, I get very nervous when we talk about translating something very fuzzy into a metric. I think that ultimately that desire is a way of either minimizing concerns or making them into something that is so easily measured that no one ever has to deal with ambiguity any longer. I think that the people who have that desire of like, I'm going to do so much sentiment analysis that I can pie chart every single human feeling, and that's both a lot of social media and a lot of sort of body modification technology is about exactly that. That desire comes from a place of not wanting to have to deal with feelings anymore, not wanting to have to deal with ambiguity, not wanting to have to deal with nuance. And ultimately, I think that we go in a very dark direction when we refuse to see nuance or ambiguity, when we think of those things as too difficult, because that's ultimately a path to very black and white thinking. And to right or wrong, yes, no, like it's ultimately, if all you want out of your feelings is an A/B test, then you don't want to feel in general. And so it's useful, but only up until a point. And I think ultimately what has been more useful about it has been in the identity formation of people, and in this sort of, again, finding a way for people to tell their own story and create their own narrative of their lives.
Well, all right. On that note, thank you so much, Madeline. It's been a pleasure having you on. Last thing before we go, please plug the book. Where is it sold? What finer bookstores carry it? How can people find it?
Let's see. How to Future: Leading and Sense Making in an Age of Hyperchange by myself and Scott Smith. is available in the UK and globally now, but in the US and Canada and North America, it will be available on the 29th. You can pre-order it now from Coke and Page, or from Amazon, or from Waterstones, or from Barnes and Noble, Powell's, Indie Bookshop, the Book Depository, like a bunch of different places. It should be available, and wherever you like to get your fix, I guess. And we hope that you enjoy it.
Fantastic. Pre-order now, folks. Make sure that algorithm knows
Yes.
how much you want that book. Quantify that desire.
Yes. Feed my cats.
Yes, feed her cats. On that note, thank you so much, Madeline. Thank you to our special live studio audience. Thank you for your questions. We'll be back next week, or in the very near future, on our next episode with Melvin Mitchell, who's going to talk about basically a Marshall program for American Black neighborhoods. So
amazing. That's fantastic.
Yeah, we'll see what he's got in mind. He just published a great essay on Architects newspaper about it, and has agreed to speak to us about it. All right, on that note, thank you so much, and we'll be back soon.
Thank you.
Take care, everyone.